Hi, thank you for watching this recording. My name is Paul Francis. I'm a psychotherapist and shamanic practitioner, and I run courses and write books on what I call therapeutic shamanism, which is an approach to shamanic work that integrates principles and practices from psychotherapy. And in this talk, I'm going to be exploring the links between shamanism and psychotherapy, looking at both their similarities and at their differences too. In doing this, I hope to show you that there is a great deal that they can learn from each other. In fact, not only is there a great deal that they can learn from each other, but there is a great deal they really need to learn from each other if, as psychotherapists in particular, we really want to be able to do the best we can for our clients and the challenges they face in this modern era. Before getting down to that though, I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you to the Institute for Arts in Therapy and Education, and in particular to its director, Dr. Margot Sutherland, for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation for this conference. I truly appreciate it. So let's dive in. In preparing this talk, I was aware that, as far as I understand it, as an audience at this conference, you were mostly psychotherapists, and the majority of you are art psychotherapists in particular. So given that, I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with the healing power of not just words, but of things like imagery, symbolism, and metaphor, and how the healing they bring can often times go far deeper than just words and talking therapies on their own. And of course, the great Carl Jung knew this too, how when we get to the deepest layers of healing, these layers are often far beyond words alone and can only really be accessed and worked with through things like imagery, sensations, symbolism, metaphors, art, and so on. To pick out just one Jung quote to illustrate this, and there were many I could have chosen, in the book The Red Book, Jung says, "My speech is imperfect, not because I want to shine with words, but out of the impossibility of finding those words, I speak in images. With nothing else can I express the words from the depths." Now, as you may know, or maybe not, Carl Jung himself was heavily influenced by shamanism. In particular, he was influenced by the work of the historian and philosopher Mircea Eliade's seminal shamanic book called Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. As well as this, Jung was influenced by anthropological reports of Siberian shamanism and by the work of the pioneering French psychologist and physician Pierre Janet, who, amongst other things, linked the shamanic concept of soul loss to things like mental impairment and dissociation. And indeed, his professional work aside, Jung's personal and inner work through his life, as chronicled in things like The Red Book, has many, many strong shamanic themes throughout it. Because, and this is true in particular with what is known as the shamanic journey, which we'll come to look at later, where the shamanic practitioner deliberately enters a non-ordinary state of consciousness, shamanism operates almost entirely in a realm far beyond words and more left brain ways of thinking. It operates in a realm that can only really be accessed and worked with through things like imagery, sensations, symbols and metaphors, through things like art and music. And it is a realm of the more right brain area of mythos, metaphorical truths, rather than the more left brain realm of logos, of literal truth. So there are indeed similarities between shamanism and any psychotherapy approaches that go beyond just the verbal. So I'm thinking of things like Jungian therapy, obviously, depth psychotherapy or depth psychology, art psychotherapy, somatic psychotherapies, and so on. In addition to these, as we shall touch on later, shamanism also has a lot in common with parts of self psychotherapies, therapies that recognize that our inner life is made of different parts of us. So I'm thinking about things like IFS, internal family systems therapy, voice dialogue work, John Rowan's subpersonality approach, and many more. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that shamanism, or at least the kind of shamanism that I practice, is the original parts of self therapy. That said, there are also key differences between psychotherapy and shamanism. Now, as most of you at this conference are psychotherapists, I am going to assume that we are all in at least broad agreement as to what we mean by the term psychotherapy. When it comes to the term shamanism, though, then I really know from experience that I really can't make the same assumption as I can about us agreeing broadly on the term psychotherapy. For context, when I first started practicing and teaching shamanism a very long time ago now, outside of academic circles, I found few people had even heard of shamanism, let alone had any idea what it actually was. Gradually, though, over the years, this began to change and this picked up pace, so much so that the 2021 government census for England and Wales showed shamanism to be the fastest growing spiritual belief system in the UK. And interest in it seems to have kept growing since then too. Now, as someone who loves shamanism deeply, who lives and breathes it, obviously this is great to see. At the same time, though, the fact is that what is emerging and being called shamanism these days is a very, very mixed bag indeed. For example, Indigenous people the world over have known that becoming an actual shaman was something that took a lifetime of work and practice. However, in our modern culture of instant gratification, as interest in shamanism has grown, you can literally now find courses online that claim to teach you to be a shaman in as little as 6 weeks and will even give you a certificate to prove it. And even in the more serious areas of the contemporary shamanic world, there is often little consensus still as to what shamanism is or isn't. So these days, the truth is there are many very different, and I mean sometimes wildly different ideas as to what shamanism is. So if in this talk, I'm going to be able to talk about what shamanism and psychotherapy have in common and how they differ and what each can learn from the other, that's only going to be possible or meaningful if I am first clear about what I mean when I am using the word shamanism here, the kind of shamanism I practice, teach and write about. So I'm going to do that first, and I'm going to be doing it also because in explaining it, I'll be introducing a lot of key concepts and ideas that when we do come to look at the question as to what psychotherapy can learn from shamanism, these will actually provide a lot of the answers, as we shall see. The shamanism I practice is a version of what is known as core shamanism. Core shamanism is a term coined by the anthropologist Michael Harner. From Harner's academic studies of shamanism, he came to realize that whilst on the surface, shamanic traditions and practices from different tribes and cultures may seem immensely varied, if you look below the surface, though, there is a remarkable consistency of ideas, practices, and way of seeing the world. And this consistency across different cultures is true to the extent that if you introduced a shaman from, say, Peru to a shaman from, say, Mongolia, opposite ends of the world, with the help of an interpreter, you would find that underneath the surface details of their shamanism, there really is a remarkable degree of shared practices and thinking, a shared cosmology. And the more Harner looked at this, the more he came to realize that this was actually a worldwide phenomenon. Completely unrelated tribes and cultures on different continents and with no historic connections to each other, all shared these core shamanic ideas, practices, experiences, and way of looking at the world. Now, at the time when Harner started doing this work, back in the 1960s and 1970s, shamanism was in crisis and in danger of possibly disappearing, because the indigenous communities that had held on to shamanism and kept it alive up to that point were themselves in crisis all over the world too. So in 1980, he wrote his seminal book, The Way of the Shaman, and went on to set up an institute to begin teaching core shamanism to people worldwide. And he dedicated the rest of his life to doing this, to trying to save shamanism for the world, really. And arguably, we may well not be here today discussing shamanism at all if it hadn't been for him doing this. Now, before we go on, and with an awareness to any concerns about issues of cultural appropriation, to be clear, this core shamanism does not belong to any one tribe or culture or to any particular geographical region or regions of the world. What we're looking at here, and the kind of shamanism I practice and teach and write about, is knowledge that is, or once was, universal, indigenous to all people if we go far enough back in time. So, given that shamanism or original core shamanism is that widespread, literally found all over the world where people have settled, that raises the next question then, how old is it? And to answer that, it is vital to understand that this original core shamanism was and is part of something larger still, namely core animism. So, what is core animism? The first thing to understand is that animism is not a religion. Unlike religions, in animism, and so of course in shamanism, there are no sacred texts, no sacred books. There's no dogma, there's no orthodoxy or heresy. There's no churches or temples or religious buildings of any kind. There is no organization. There's no priesthoods. There's no leaders. There's no hierarchy of any kind. There are no beliefs or leaps of faith necessary to practice it. Instead, animism describes an ancient way of personally and directly experiencing the world around us. A way of experiencing the world around us and being in the world that, as we shall come on to see, is quite different to how we experience the world and act in the world in the modern era. So animism is a lived experience. It's not a belief, and it is the lived experience, and again, not belief, that absolutely everything, humans, animals, plants, and even things like mountains and rivers and the land itself are alive and conscious. And remember, this is not a belief in animism, this is literally what animists experience. The academic James Harvey, when writing about animism, put it like this. He said, "Animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others." And in terms of how animists live their life in relationship with others, animists do not see humans as being superior in any way at all. Instead, animism is really profoundly non-hierarchical in the way it perceives the world. This is sometimes described as animism being a spiritual round table, where everybody at this table, including the other than human people, are equals. So animals, plants, mountains and rivers, even the land itself, are seen as equals. And not just as equals, but crucially as family, as kin, as relatives. So animists talk about and really mean things like brother wolf, sister eagle, mother tree, grandfather mountain, great mother earth, and so on. These are all our relatives, our relations. So central to animism is the idea of healthy community, of healthy tribe, not just human tribe, but a larger tribe that we all belong to. And in core animism, this idea of healthy community has three aspects. It includes the internal, what as psychotherapists we might regard as parts of self. So central to animism is living in right relationship with the different inner parts of us and having what they call a healthy inner tribe. Second, this idea of community includes the external, living in right relationship with the other members of our human tribe and in healthy human to human relationships and healthy human cultures. And thirdly, and crucially, and actually a defining characteristic of animism, it includes living in respectful and reciprocal right relationship with the other than human people that we share this world with too. So fundamentally, animism is a relationship of ecology, of mutual interdependence and respect and cooperation. Now, if we look at the non-agricultural but actual original hunter-gatherer cultures that we have records of, and we're talking here about thousands of different hunter-gatherer tribes and cultures from across the globe, what we see is that every single one of those was animist. Not only animist, but animist to the extent that every single aspect of their culture was based on animist principles. So originally, core animism was quite literally the blueprint, the template on which all hunter-gatherer cultures were based. Now, just quickly before I move on, at this point, some of you may be thinking, where's the evidence for this? And if so, fair enough. Despite practicing shamanism, which in some people's eyes might make me seem a bit wacky, I'm actually somebody who really values critical thinking and fact checks everything and who wants evidence too. And the evidence about what I've been saying about animism and hunter-gatherer cultures is all there. However, it's a vast topic on its own, and obviously in this presentation I only have so much time. But if you go to the website, and I've put the web address at the bottom of this slide, www.therapeutic-shamanism.co.uk, and you look at the menu bar along the top of that page and then click on Learn More and then on Resources, you will find masses of resources if you do want to explore all this more and find the evidence. You'll find articles, videos, blogs, podcasts, book suggestions, and much more. And I'll put that website address at the end of this recording too. So, back to animism and hunter-gatherers. As Homo sapiens, modern humans, we are around about 300,000 years old as a species. Until recently, that figure was usually put around 200,000 years, but recent discoveries have pushed this back to around about 300,000 years. Now, we only began to abandon hunter-gathering on a large scale around about 11,000 BC. Prior to this, all humans lived as hunter-gatherers. And that means for an astonishing 95% or so of human history, all humans were hunter-gatherers. And so, in all likelihood, and again, there's a massive evidence around this, they were people who lived and breathed animism too. That means around 95% of the generations of your ancestors, of my ancestors, lived and breathed animism. And this makes core animism and animist-based cultures incredibly ancient. At the very least, tens of thousands of years older than any other spiritual path that exists these days. Because all the other contemporary spiritual paths only actually begin to emerge once we begin to abandon animism. Animism is just different. Now, remember what I said about how animism is universal, or was once universal. Something that underpinned literally all human cultures. And then on top of that, from the evidence we have, it seems to be incredibly ancient too. And this has led many people, including anthropologists and other academics, to conclude, based on the evidence, that animism is something that is somehow almost hardwired into us, a more natural, more ancient way of being, something that's intrinsic, or once was intrinsic, to being human, our original state, if you like. So, why on earth did we abandon it? What changed? Now, that is actually a truly fascinating story, but it is an enormous story too. And it's a story I do cover in other recordings and in my books and so on. But here I can only really outline the bare bones of it, enough of it that we need to then go on to look at the links between shamanism and psychotherapy. So the original animist cultures were what the author and novelist Daniel Quinn, in his seminal books Ishmael and The Story of B, called lever cultures. In these cultures, these animist cultures, people mostly tried to take only as much as they really needed and leave the rest. Lever cultures. And when they did take what they needed, this was done with respect and gratitude to the other than human, and knowing that they needed to find ways to give back too. And in that way to be of service to the world, not just a consumer of the world. And Daniel Quinn contrasted this to the culture we live in now, which he called taker culture. A culture that is profoundly hierarchical, that is mostly based on power over relationships, the rich having power over the poor, men generally having power over women, certain races and or cultures having power over others, and all humans having power over the other than human. A culture that wants to consume the world around it, that wants to take everything it can and leave nothing. The psychotherapy point I'm trying to get across here is that for the vast majority of human history, around 95% of it, we were wired very differently to how we are wired these days. How we think these days, even how we perceive and experience the world, is not how we would have for the vast majority of human history. In fact, the reality is that if you look at the broader sweep of human history, the way we are now is not the norm. And yet we have forgotten this, something Daniel Quinn calls the great forgetting. And because of this great forgetting, we do see how we are these days as the norm, as how things have always been, as just human nature, just how it is. Whereas this is simply, factually and objectively not true. There is nothing normal about how we are now. So it's not surprising that we have records from all over the world of original animist people saying, when they first encounter us modern human people, they say that we modern people are not at all normal. In fact, they usually say that we seem to be quite insane. So, how on earth did we end up like this? Around about 11,000 BC, starting in certain areas of the world and then spreading outwards in what will go on to be a worldwide change, we begin to abandon hunter-gatherers lifestyle and animism and tend to move towards agriculture instead. This is known as the Neolithic Revolution. Now, as this spreads and gathers pace, then around 4000 BC, we see the first city-state cultures begin to emerge, ushering in the period that we now call civilization, which is from the Latin civitas, meaning city. So civilization basically meaning city-state based cultures or city-based cultures. And when it comes to looking at psychotherapy and shamanism and animism, the essential point to understand here is this all begins to change not only our outer world and the world around us, but our inner world too, in some really profound ways. So people usually think of our adoption of agriculture as us humans learning to domesticate other species, other animals, and plants too, of course. However, as many people have also argued, we also domesticated ourselves in this process too. For example, the academic James C. Scott, in his brilliant book, Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States, says our adoption of agriculture, for reasons he goes into detail in the book, results in us becoming more controllable, more compliant, more domesticated. And anthropologists and other people, in spending time amongst the few remaining original animist cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures that survived into recent times, often comment on how much more vibrant the senses of original animist people seem to be, how much more fully alive they seem to be, and how much our modern day domesticated lives have dumbed down our senses, and how much less alive, less embodied, and less vibrant modern human beings are in comparison to hunter-gatherer animist people. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of people who spent time in original animist cultures describe the people in those original cultures to be, on the whole, far happier than most modern humans. Pretty much all the accounts we have, all the research we have, points to these original animist cultures as having far, far better mental health than ours, vastly lower rates of anxiety and of depression, and that these were cultures of people who laughed a lot, who were emotionally literate and comfortable with their feelings, who were grounded and fully present and comfortable in their bodies. And in many, many accounts, these people are described as being kind, generous, vibrant, and happy. Now, as a psychotherapist, I'm sure I don't need me to tell you that this is quite different from the mental health crisis we see today, with soaring rates of anxiety and depression ever rising. Now, before I move on, I just want to quickly clarify one thing that sometimes comes up here. In saying all this about original animist hunter-gatherer people, I am not in any way someone who falls into the myth of what the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau called the noble savage. I don't for a moment think that hunter-gatherer societies were perfect or without their problems. I really don't. And nor am I a primitivist, someone who decides to forego modern technology and medicine and so on. In fact, I live in a perfectly normal semi-detached house, and I really enjoy having things like running water, hot showers, and a refrigerator and so on. So what I am saying is not about putting hunter-gatherer animist people on a pedestal and having some kind of romanticized version of them. Rather, it is simply about that if we take any actual sane measure of how healthy a culture is, so not things like GDP, gross domestic product, or disposable income and so on, but instead things like mental health, happiness, fulfillment, and not to forget ecological sustainability too, then by those sane measures of a healthy culture, whilst not perfect, original animist cultures were getting a lot more things right than we are these days. So, with that overview of core animism and core shamanism, now let's turn to the question as to what psychotherapy can learn from all this. So, as I've been saying, for the vast majority of human history, we lived as hunter-gatherers. And that meant we lived in tribes of somewhere between 20 to 150 people. Generally, once a tribe got bigger than that, it would tend to split into two smaller tribes. That meant for the vast majority of human history, getting on for 300,000 years, we were surrounded by people in our lives who we would have known personally and intimately. And the sight of a stranger, someone not known to us, would have been an extremely rare thing in those days. Then, as I said, starting around 4000 BC, for reasons I just don't have the time to go into here, we see people beginning to move en masse into the first cities. For the first time in human history, that means we start to live in crowded conditions, surrounded by hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who were strangers to us. And we weren't evolved for this change. This was a very rapid change. And the stresses this brings, the challenges it raises, are simply not something our nervous system has had time to evolve to cope with. Now, as psychotherapists, I'm sure you are all familiar with the concept of masking, which is the unconscious or conscious suppression or hiding of one's true emotions, thoughts, or identity to conform to social expectations and try to avoid judgment and to try to project yourself and in a particular way and protect yourself from perceived harm. It's a term, of course, often discussed in relation to neurodiversity as the way the neurodiverse cope with living in today's culture, which is often not very neurodiversely friendly. Although, just as an aside, I much prefer the term neuro-wild to neurodiverse, as I think it's less pathologizing as a term. Now, masking is, of course, often understood as a trauma response too, as a way to try and fit in by presenting an acceptable persona, acceptable face or mask to the outer world. And looked at in this way, the rise of what we call civilization of our modern era taker-based culture is also one massive society-wide masking in order to try and regulate ourselves to cope with the immense psychological pressures of this new way of living and being. What this means is, to fit into this new modern era, we had to suppress our original animist-based nature. We learned to and were forced to push down certain thoughts, feelings, behaviours, and this involved, as James C. Scott says, even literally dulling down our senses so that we're kind of less aware of what is around us and less reactive to it. We have to learn to cut off from what we know to be true deep down, from what our body, our gut and our bones tell us, and instead we have to believe what we're told to believe by this new culture instead. Which is why, of course, as part of our domestication, we are taught wonky thoughts about our bodies. We're taught our body is corrupt, that it's animal, that it's bestial, and so not to be trusted because animals are less superior to us humans, and that our body is of lower vibration and needs to be transcended or denied, and so on. And this is deliberately to cut us off from what deep down we know to be true and to force us to listen to this new culture instead that's often in many ways going against our true nature. And the result of all this, and there's much more I could go into if there was time, is the inevitable emergence of an enormous reservoir, a whole vast ocean, in fact, of repressed material in our psyches. The ocean that is our personal and collective unconscious in Jungian terms. The parts of our psyche that we've had to disown and deny in order to live in this, what animists say is an insanity that we call modern civilization. Now, just before moving on, I do want to clarify that, of course, it's not that hunter-gatherer animists had no repressed material either, because all societies require a degree of conforming, essentially. What is different, though, with the birth of so-called civilization is the scale of this, the vast industrialized scale of this, and how far this takes us from what we have been before. Now, as therapists, I'm sure you know that repressed material doesn't just magically go away. Instead, quite the opposite, it festers and haunts us. It becomes what Jung called the shadow. And of course, this affects us not just as individuals, but it affects how we relate to others too. And so it affects the kind of social relationships we have and the kind of societies we then create. Because healthy people are likely to want to create healthy societies, and unhealthy people will almost inevitably create unhealthy societies too. And so with all this repressed material and this domestication, we then start to act out our inner repression onto the outer world too. Unconscious material becomes projected outwards onto others. And so with the rise of civilization and our domestication, we see the othering of things. We see the rise of patriarchy and misogyny, the persecution of minority groups, or of anyone who is perceived as being different and what is not deemed to be normal. And we then invent religions to back this up, religions that tell us how to behave, what isn't acceptable, and religions that are themselves usually patriarchal, hierarchical, homophobic, and often used to justify racism and so on. And not surprisingly, none of this actually makes us happy. So here we are with soaring rates of depression and anxiety, medicating ourselves with drugs, legal or illegal, medicating ourselves with excessive consumption that just ends up making us feel worse and worse, with social media addiction and so on and so on. And at the same time, of course, because of our by now completely broken human supremacist based relationship with the other than human people too, with the animal, plant and stone people, we're now destroying the world around us too. We are, of course, living in what's sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene extinction era, a mass extinction event of our own human making. And even though many people try to blot this out and carry on as normal, deep down in our psyches, in our bones, we know that the world around us is dying, that we are killing the world around us. And this knowing, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is sometimes referred to as ecological grief. In his beautiful book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief, the psychotherapist Francis Weller identifies what he calls the 5 gates of grief. These are, number 1, the loss of the beloved, grief for the people, places and things we love, including the natural world. Number 2, the loss of the living world, grief for the destruction of ecosystems and species. Number 3, the loss of our souls, grief for the parts of ourselves we have suppressed or lost. Number 4, the loss of our ancestors, grief for the wisdom, traditions, and connections we've severed. Number 5, the loss of our future, grief for the world we are leaving for future generations. Now, if you look back over those, ecological grief intersects with at least 2 of those, numbers 2 and 5, and really, if you look a bit deeper, with all of them. With number 1, grief for the things we love and are losing, including the natural world. Number 2, grief for the destruction of ecosystems and species. Number 3, grief for the parts of ourselves we have suppressed or lost that I've just been talking about. Number 4, grief for the wisdom and traditions and connections that we've severed, our animist past. Number 5, grief for the world we are leaving for future generations. Now, after around 6,000 years of this so-called civilization, in an attempt to restore some sanity to this madness, around about 120 to 150 years ago, of course, psychotherapy emerges. And of course, psychotherapy does help people. It helped me. In fact, given my own childhood, it not only helped me, but it literally saved me. So, in saying any criticism of psychotherapy, it's constructive criticism, because I love psychotherapy deeply and owe it so much. I love it almost as much as I love animism and shamanism. And I worked as a psychotherapy in private practice for nearly 30 years, and I've taught psychotherapy, run colleges in psychotherapy, and so on. And to this day, although I'm retired from one-to-one work, I spent a lot of my life championing psychotherapy and recommending it to people. And because of that, I want it to be as good as it can be. So this is constructive criticism. Because for all that is great about it, at the moment, if we're honest, there are problems with it too that we're going to go on to look at. Now, to understand these problems, remember earlier on I said that core shamanism was part of core animism. So originally, all shamans were animists, first and foremost. Every aspect of their thinking and way of being in the world was informed by animism. So originally, a shaman was somebody who was, in addition to being an animist, also had the ability to enter a specific type of trance state, sometimes referred to as SSC, which stands for Shamanic State of Consciousness. And in this altered state of consciousness, they could perform various kinds of healing and communicate with the other than human people, and in doing so, gain knowledge, teaching, and guidance from the other than human people. Now, when in this shamanic state of consciousness, in what is known as a shamanic journey, shamans would experience themselves traveling in what are known as the shamanic realms. Now, shamans pretty much the world over experience these shamanic realms as being divided into 3 broad, distinct areas. And these are known as the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. Broadly, the upper world is the realm of what these days most people mean by spirit or spirituality. The realm of spirit beings, the sky realm, the realm of Father Sky, whatever you want to call that. The middle world is both this physical, everyday, ordinary reality, but also the non-physical things and beings behind it. And the lower world is the realm of the peoples and of nature, the animal, plant and stone people, and of Mother Earth herself. Now, let's take a look at modern day humans and their relationship with all this. Imagine, if you will, a tiny little box, a little cube, only 1 millimeter across in all directions. This box and what's inside it represents your everyday awareness, whatever you are focused on at any given moment of time. So right now, for example, hopefully your awareness is focused on this talk. You could, though, of course, shift that awareness to something else. You could shift it to becoming aware of your feet, or to an object in the room, or so on. And this is what your everyday awareness is. A tiny little dot of consciousness that you can move around at will and choose to use it to focus on different things, essentially. Now, imagine that tiny little 1 millimeter box of your ordinary everyday awareness is floating inside in the middle of a box 100 times bigger in all directions, a 1 centimeter box. And this box represents your subconscious, the things that aren't right at the moment in your awareness, but which could easily be brought into awareness. So things like what you ate for supper last night, for example, or where did you last go on holiday, or what's your PIN number, and so on. Now, imagine that 1 centimeter box of your subconscious is in turn floating inside yet another box, again 100 times bigger. This is a 1 meter cube. And this box represents your personal unconscious. All the things you have suppressed and hidden and cast out or banished from your conscious awareness. Forgotten memories and feelings, issues that you don't want to face and which remain unprocessed and unresolved. The kind of things that, of course, as psychotherapists, we help our clients bring into their awareness, because, as Carl Jung said, one of my favourite quotes by anybody ever, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, by bringing things out of the unconscious and into our consciousness, where they can then be processed, resolved, and integrated. Now, the next line of that quote that often gets missed out is Jung went on to say, the latter procedure of making the darkness conscious, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular, which is why, of course, not everybody wants to do the work of psychotherapy. Most people prefer to not bring things out of their unconscious and make them conscious. Now, let's come back to the boxes. So we've got 3 boxes so far. The tiny sort of pinprick of our awareness, and that's floating in a larger box of our subconscious, things that we can bring to mind if we want to, and that in turn is floating in a larger box of our own personal unconscious, the stuff we've actually cast away out of our consciousness. Now, imagine that box in turn, the box of our subconscious, this 1 meter cube, is itself floating in the middle of an even larger cube, again 100 times bigger. So this is 1 kilometre across. Or is that 1,000 times bigger? It doesn't matter. This represents the collective unconscious, what we as a whole, as a society on a collective level have suppressed from our consciousness, and as a species refuse to acknowledge or deal with, and so remains unresolved in this collective unconscious. Now, that is the realm of our inner landscape these days. Our inner landscape consists of these boxes essentially. And all of these boxes, this kind of Russian doll of boxes, actually is floating inside something much, much, much bigger still. The other than human world. Because these boxes, of course, are just human boxes, and they exist within a much, much bigger world of the other than human. And then beyond that are the shamanic realms, the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And the problem these days is that we have forgotten what is outside the boxes, or we don't relate to what's outside the boxes anymore. We have instead cut ourselves off and retreated into the human. Now, as psychotherapists, here's a really, really important point to understand about shamanism, because it is a mistake psychotherapists very commonly make about shamanism and the shamanic journey. Shamans are 100% clear that the actual shamanic realms, the realms outside of the human boxes, are not realms of human imagination. They are not the human realms of our human unconscious, but something else again. The shamanic realms are something that exists entirely independent of humans. However, the mistake psychotherapists usually make, I see this over and over again, is that they assume that the shamanic realms are just the realms of human imagination. So in other words, they think that the shamanic realms are the same as the realms of the unconscious, that shamanic journeys are just an imaginal way of exploring the unconscious, personal or collective. And in fact, the unconscious is what I call the underworld, and it's completely different to the lower world and the middle world and the upper world, because those shamanic realms are independent of humans. But therapists tend to, because it's our training and our default position is to reduce everything down to the human, to put the human at center stage. Let me give you an example to illustrate this. Say, as a therapist, a client comes in one day with a soft toy of an elephant that they brought with them to the session. And the client tells you that they saw this in a shop window and they just had to go buy it. Now, as therapists, how we then respond to the client here will depend on our therapy orientation. So, more solution-focused therapists, whilst they may acknowledge the elephant in the room, might not actually be that interested in exploring it any further because they want to move on to what they think the focus of the therapy needs to be instead. Other therapists, other more client-led therapists, may instead choose to explore the elephant. And in doing so, they might help their client uncover a memory of how, for example, the client's cold and distant father, who the client thought didn't ever notice them or care about them as a child, one day their father came home from a business trip and gave them a toy elephant they'd bought for them. And so that toy elephant symbolized how their father must care for them really, even though they rarely or ever showed it in other ways. So that would be an example then of the therapist helping the client bring something from their personal unconscious, something they'd forgotten about and buried, into their consciousness. And the elephant becomes a sort of vehicle for that. The elephant is kind of something from their unconscious trying to make itself conscious, in effect. Now, another kind of therapist, one who, in addition to this, has an interest in the collective unconscious, not just the personal unconscious, may also go on to explore the wider symbolism of elephant too, how it's perceived in human cultures, what it tends to be associated with, and so on in different human cultures, and see if that helps the client explore this more as well. Now, all of these approaches have their uses. They're all valid. They're all different, but they all have a validity. Useful material might come out of all of them. From an animist point of view, though, they all miss something. Because a further area of exploration that an animist might perceive and that animism opens up is this. Maybe the elephant is not just a symbol of something in the personal and or collective unconscious, but is actually other than human. Actual elephant trying to make itself known to the client. Now, that might sound to you a bit preposterous or like magical thinking, or hard to get your head around what that would actually mean. If so, then I just ask you to entertain the possibility that if that is your reaction, then maybe this illustrates just how much we have been conditioned to thinking inside the human boxes. How hard it is, how alien it is to entertain the possibility that something real and alive lies outside of these, and that everything is not just a symbol of something from the human unconscious. Now, if you did have that reaction, I completely understand, because as a therapist, and in fact as a modern day human, supposedly rational human, that's how we're told to think. I say supposedly rational because let's remember, according to animist people, what we call rational is in fact pretty insane. So I do understand. All I can say though is that if and when people begin to explore shamanism for themselves, actual original shamanism, core shamanism, not the modern day human-centric versions of it, then this changes. The boundaries of the human box, the limitations of it, the domesticated, dumbed down and caged off way that we currently live begins to soften and dissolve. And then you begin to experience for yourself the actual lived reality that there really is a whole world of real, living, sentient beings beyond the human who can be communicated with. And in that way, bit by bit, in doing that, our original, true, interconnected and sane animist nature begins to emerge. If we don't do this, we continue to reduce the other than human down to mere symbols of things in our unconscious, in our psychotherapy work. And in that way, as therapists, we remain trapped in this human-centric cage, and we keep our clients there too. And from an animist perspective, this is being trapped in human narcissism, telling ourselves stories of human supremacy, essentially, reducing everything down to the human, as if the world and everything in it revolves around us. All the time in doing this, anxiety and depression levels continue to rise, and we burn the world around us too. And let's not forget, therapy emerged around 120 to 150 years ago, and in that time, depression rates and anxiety rates have risen and risen and risen at a terrifying rate over the last 10, 20 or 30 years as well. So, if as a psychotherapist we do this to our clients, reduce everything they bring down to the human, down to human-centric symbols and metaphors, then for all the undeniable good that psychotherapy does, and remember, I love psychotherapy, in addition, therapy becomes part of the problem too, a maintaining cause of our clients' domestication and their isolation from their healthier, animist, interconnected nature. Now, as therapists, obviously we want to help people and we don't want to be part of this problem. And the great news is that animism, if we let it, shows us how to break out of this human-centric cage and fix this disconnection. And not just in theory. One of the things I really, really love about animism and shamanism is that they are immensely practical. They give us tools and practices that actually work, tools that really do help us recover from our domestication and our isolation, and really do help us to reconnect to our deeper true nature and to the other than human world again. I see this time and time and time again with my students. These tools, and they are tools that we can learn to use as psychotherapists, include, of course, shamanic journeying. And once we master shamanic journeying properly, this can easily be incorporated into our psychotherapy work. The specifics of how to do that, of course, is an enormous topic and way beyond what I can really get into here. I mean, here, all I can really do is hope to whet your appetite about these things in the hope that it makes you want to explore more. But learning how to integrate shamanic journeying into our psychotherapy work really does open up whole new worlds in terms of how effective psychotherapy can be and what we can offer our clients. And in addition to shamanic journeying, there are many, many, many other tools as well that animism and shamanism can offer us in terms of expanding and broadening and deepening our psychotherapy practice. And there's more, because it's not just additional tools and practices that animism and shamanism can offer us. Now, again, I can only briefly touch on this here, but as well as all the practices hard baked into animism and shamanism, there is also a deep foundation of knowledge and wisdom too. Knowledge of what does and doesn't constitute healthy relationship. A clear, deep, wise, and profound model of what it is to be fully and healthily human. This body of knowledge forms part of what in animism is sometimes referred to as the original instructions. You'll sometimes see these called the original songs or the original stories or the original dances too. These are fundamental to core original animism, and what they do is provide a template of how to live in right relationship with ourselves, with other humans, and with the other than human world around us too. And these can be profoundly useful in terms of forming a basis for our psychotherapy work as well. There are many, many other things that original core animism and shamanism can offer psychotherapy, but I only have time really to pick out a couple more as examples here. The first I want to discuss is the issue of power loss in animism and shamanism. Now, by power loss, shamans and animists mean something much bigger than the loss of personal power as we may understand it in psychotherapy. Somebody feeling disempowered, lacking confidence and self-esteem and so on. It's something bigger than just that. Now, remember, central to animism is interconnection, not just with the human world, but as I kept trying to stress, with the other than human world too. And in animism, it is understood that health is dependent on this interconnection because everything, including us, is actually part of a larger whole. Everything is like a cell that's part of a larger body. So when we become disconnected from this larger body, this greater whole, just as a cell would, we become weakened, and this leads us to disease and illness. And it's this disconnection from the larger whole that we are meant to be a part of. This is what shamans mean by power loss, because it weakens us. Power here being life force that comes from interconnection, essentially. In today's society, by separating ourselves off from nature and from the other than human people to the extent that we have, and instead living lives that are almost entirely spent amongst other humans and in human-made environments. And let's not forget, even much of what we think of as being nature these days is now largely farmed, denatured, tamed, domesticated and degraded. We are now suffering from what, from an animist perspective, is a society-wide epidemic of profound and catastrophic power loss. The symptoms of this, the symptoms of power loss, are many, but include things like a pervasive listlessness and sense of emptiness, and that nothing quite seems to really fill our lives or give us meaning and purpose. Anxiety, depression, a deep sense of loneliness, apathy, purposelessness, feeling like there must somehow be something more to life, and so on. Now, while psychotherapy can, of course, help deal with some of these to some extent, no amount of psychotherapy, not as it's currently practiced, can ever be anything other than a partial fix for this if the underlying cause is actually power loss. Not until or unless, as psychotherapists, we learn to see this for what it is, the deeper underlying cause, the power loss, and begin to learn how to help our clients address this and reconnect with the healthy, untamed and undomesticated, the wild, both within themselves and within the other than human world around them too. As well as power loss, another issue I want to touch on briefly here is the hugely important issue of soul loss. Central to shamanism is the understanding that parts of us can become separated off from us. And of course, we have a similar idea or ideas in psychotherapy. For example, in psychotherapy, there is the concept of disassociation, where someone is no longer fully present and in their body, but in effect somewhere else. And then in parts of self-therapy, such as IFS, voice dialogue therapy, John Rowan's sub-personality work, and so on, it is recognised that parts of us may become marginalised and pushed out to the extent that they become effectively lost to our awareness and consciousness. And so, in parts of self-therapy approaches, we seek to bring those marginalised parts back into awareness. Doing that usually involves identifying them and then dialoguing with them, listening to them, getting to know them, getting them any healing they may need if they're traumatized, and maybe doing that through things like EMDR or somatic work and so on, and then helping them reintegrate back into the larger whole, essentially. All of which, though, if you think about it, presupposes and assumes that marginal parts are still hanging around somewhere. They are still, in effect, in the room, present in the therapy room. And so they can be found and then worked with. And of course, a lot of the time that's true. That's why parts of self-therapies work. Shamans, though, understand that sometimes this isn't always the case. That sometimes parts aren't just marginalized, but they are literally gone. They are no longer in the room. They're not hanging around, but they've gone and left altogether. And of course, in that case, you can't dialogue with a part that isn't there to be dialogued with. And understanding that parts of us are not always just marginalized, but can actually leave altogether, is what shamans call soul loss. Knowing the signs and symptoms to look out for to spot this, and then knowing what to do about this, is completely central to shamanic work. Knowing what to do about it is what shamans call soul retrieval. And it's not the same thing as parts of self-work. It is something that is pretty much unique to shamanism. It's a shamanic specialism. It's something shamans have been doing for tens of thousands of years. And just as no amount of psychotherapy as it's currently practiced can deal with issues that are caused by power loss, no amount of parts of self-work will ever be sufficient if the underlying problem is actually soul loss. And shamanism shows us how to do this. So shamanism can help us reach the parts of self that psychotherapy as it's currently practiced can't. So I want to just lastly mention two other huge areas of animism and shamanism that have a lot they can offer psychotherapy. And one relates to the idea of what are sometimes called unattached burdens. In doing parts of self-psychotherapy, many therapists over time have sometimes reluctantly but inevitably come to the conclusion that sometimes what might first appear to be a part of self in a client, on closer work turns out to be something else entirely, something that is not actually part of the client, but something that is not actually part of them. In IFS, for instance, internal family systems therapy, this is sometimes known as what's called unattached burdens, things that are attached to the client but aren't actually part of them, things that they are carrying but which don't belong to them. Now, whilst it is genuinely great to see some areas of psychotherapy beginning to wake up to this issue and take it on board. At the same time, and again, I mean this as constructive criticism, from an original animist and shamanic perspective, much of how psychotherapy currently works with this still falls short by quite a long way. And it is an issue that animism and shamanism have been working with for literally tens of thousands of years. And so they have a huge amount that they can offer psychotherapy around this, and which psychotherapy can and ideally needs to really learn about from shamanism and animism. On a similar note, there is the growing realization, and this is backed up by the science of epigenetics, that sometimes what a client is dealing with and experiencing isn't just their own issues, but trauma that has been passed down to them over generations of time. And this is sometimes referred to as ancestral burdens and or intergenerational trauma. And again, it's great to see a growing awareness of this in some corners of psychotherapy. But again, understanding this issue, how to spot it and what to do about it is a absolutely massive and ancient part of animist and shamanic psychotherapy knowledge, wisdom and practice. And so again, there is a huge amount that psychotherapy could learn from animism and shamanism about this. So I hope that's given you some idea of the enormous amount that psychotherapy could usefully learn from core shamanism and core animism. And if that has in any way convinced you, and I do know, and I've been teaching this stuff long enough to know that this won't be for everybody. However, if it has, at least for some of you, made you curious and made you want to explore more, then I do want to say just a little bit about what shamanism these days really needs to learn from psychotherapy too. And I want to start with a very important issue. If what I have been saying so far has made you think about seeking out the help of a shamanic practitioner, then just a word about that. In original shamanic cultures, the process of becoming a shaman, as I said earlier, was long and it was an arduous one. It wasn't just about learning a set of practices and techniques or about learning just a body of knowledge. It involved as well undergoing deep and profound psychological change too. Because, as Jung said, one doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Now, of course, any psychotherapy that works at depth involves this too. Psychotherapy helps us deconstruct our unhealthy, wonky, and outmoded stories, scripts, beliefs, introjects, and so on, and involves us deconstructing our old sense of self and replacing this with a healthier one. And shamans understood the need for that too. And so becoming a shaman, it involved a deep descent into the darkness of the unconscious and undergoing being psychologically dismantled over and over again and then rebuilt into something new. However, and this is where the problem lies, in these days, in our culture of instant gratification, the sad and tragic fact is that a lot of modern day shamanism doesn't do this at all. Rather than making the darkness conscious, a lot of modern day shamanism instead does just imagine figures of light. And in fact, modern day shamanism, with its promise of instant gratification, the sad truth is it attracts many people who really don't want to look inside themselves and do the necessary inner work of psychological change, but instead try to bypass this, and shamanism being part of that bypassing. People who, as Jung said, find the idea of making the darkness conscious disagreeable, and so who will do anything to try to avoid having to do that. In this way, the sad truth is that much of contemporary shamanism has become a form of what the psychologist John Wellwood called spiritual bypassing. The attempt to use spiritual beliefs, practices, or experiences to try to avoid dealing with uncomfortable or painful emotions, avoid dealing with unresolved wounds or psychological needs and issues. Essentially, it's where spirituality becomes a way to bypass or escape personal growth, escape emotional healing, or confronting difficult realities. Now, obviously that doesn't work, and instead it leads to things like a lack of personal growth and self-awareness, acting out our unresolved wounds and traumas because they don't go away. Instead they fester and grow. It results in projection and transference of our issues onto the outside world. A lack of authenticity and ability to make authentic connection, unhealthy power dynamics, toxic positivity, and so on. And the sad but true fact is there is a lot of this in the contemporary shamanic community. So if you are going to look for a shamanic practitioner, I do just urge you to be aware of this and these issues and to be very discerning. So that said, remember what I was saying earlier about how original shamanism evolved in what were, by any sane measure, healthier times. And then how our domestication of ourselves changed us psychologically and led to this enormous ocean of repressed unconscious material, both personal and collective. The problem is that traditional shamanism often fails to understand this and what has happened to us. Let's look at an example. In traditional shamanism, when there was soul loss caused by things like bereavement or shock or trauma and so on, a shaman could simply journey to find the lost soul part and bring it back for the client, and usually there would be no problems with reintegrating it. Today, though, as well as suffering soul loss through things like shock and trauma, a lot of modern day soul loss is something we do to ourselves. We send parts of ourself away, our vulnerability, our wildness, our assertiveness, our joyfulness, and so on, to try to fit into modern day life. and into dysfunctional family situations and schools and jobs and so on. So we send part of ourselves or parts of ourselves away, and then other parts remain and try to adapt our behavior to mask and fit in. And in things like IFS, they would refer to these parts that remain and try to fit in as being the protector parts, the managers and the firefighters. Or in voice dialogue work, they would be described as the protector controller part, the inner critic, the perfectionist, the pleaser, and so on. And in shamanism, we call these parts that stay the fort holders, the parts that kind of stayed and try to kind of hold the fort, essentially. Now, the result being that these days, if a modern shaman simply does a cell retrieval, journeys, gets a lost cell part and just tries to bring it back as normal, then unless the protector parts are fully on board with that lost part coming back, then they're simply going to send it away again. And so the cell retrieval either just doesn't work, or it'll only work for so long. Eventually, that part will just leave or get sent away again. And this is where psychotherapy can really come in, something that modern day shamanic practitioners need to take on board. That parts of self therapies can provide the necessary understanding and tools to be able to dialogue with the protector parts and get them on board first, so that the process of bringing a lost part back actually holds, that it kind of sticks, essentially. Because we do live in changed times and we are not the people we used to be. There's a lot more I could say about how contemporary shamanism needs to learn things from psychotherapy as well. But that would be a different talk to a different audience, essentially. And we're running out of time. And so now I want to start wrapping things up by just saying a little bit about what an integrated shamanism and psychotherapy looks like. So, fluidity and responsiveness. It follows a client's process organically and appropriately. Sometimes in that case, the work looks like, and indeed is, normal therapy. At times, it's talking therapy or art therapy, or at other times, parts work or somatic work, etc., depending what's appropriate for the client. At other times, though, when appropriate, it can also flow into incorporating shamanic journeys, maybe even including soul retrieval, and it will incorporate other skills and practices from animism and shamanism too when they are appropriate. Working beyond the human box. The therapist is no longer isolated in a room and in the human box, but instead the presence of the other than human is welcomed into the room too where appropriate. The therapist and the client are supported by and sometimes even guided by the wisdom of the other than human too. And not everything is just then reduced down to the human and down to symbols or metaphors. Healing the root cause, power loss. The therapist understands and recognizes that anxiety, apathy, and depression and so on can be symptoms of power loss. And so the therapy expands to help the client reweave themselves back into the larger web of nature and of life, actively communicating with the earth rather than the therapy just helping the client adjust to fit into what is a dysfunctional society. Soul loss, unattached burdens, and ancestral lineage healing. So, in addition to recognizing and addressing the issues of power loss, the therapist knows how to recognize and address the issues of soul loss, of unattached burdens in a deeper way than is currently practiced in psychotherapy, and ancestral lineage issues too. And an important issue I need to mention, of course, is the issue of safeguarding. An integrated shamanism and psychotherapy understands when shamanic work is appropriate and when it is not. Shamanism involves being able to move between ordinary reality and shamanic reality at will. The essential thing here being the ability to come back from non-ordinary reality at will. This means to do shamanic work safely, it is important to be relatively grounded in this reality too. If then a client is prone to schizophrenic episodes, paranoid fantasies, severe dissociation, or unmanaged manic depression, they are already struggling to maintain a grip on this ordinary reality. And in these situations, things like shamanic journeys are usually contraindicated, and the therapist instead needs to focus more on grounding and this ordinary reality instead, and providing the client with tools to be able to do that. So if any of what I've been saying is of interest to you, and I do understand it isn't everybody's cup of tea, and you are now wondering how long it takes to train in shamanism, to be able to incorporate it into your psychotherapy work, this is a question I get asked a lot by psychotherapists. And the assumption usually is, where they're usually coming from, is they think shamanism is something they can learn to do as a sort of quick CPD, a continual professional development course, a kind of add-on to the psychotherapy work they do. And if that's the case, then unfortunately you might not want to hear this answer. There are no shortcuts to learning shamanism. And being a psychotherapist is not a shortcut when it comes to learning shamanism. Of course, if you want to combine shamanism and psychotherapy, then obviously already being a psychotherapist covers the psychotherapy side of this. But the shamanic side still takes as long to learn as it does for people who are not psychotherapists. Being a psychotherapist does not mean you can learn shamanism more quickly. I've been teaching this for a long time now, and I've had thousands of students over the years, and hundreds and hundreds of those have been psychotherapists as well. And I'm sorry, but in no case ever have I seen being a psychotherapist to be a shortcut when it comes to learning shamanism. There are no shortcuts, not if you really want to learn this work properly rather than some dumbed down, domesticated approximation of it. And there is a lot of that around. Shamanism is a profound and ancient craft, and just as becoming A psychotherapist takes years of study, supervision, and personal work. Becoming a safe and an effective shamanic practitioner takes years too. So if you do, though, want to be able to integrate shamanism and psychotherapy, and if you do that, I promise you the sum of that, what emerges, will be immensely bigger than just the parts. Whilst it does take time, while you are learning the shamanic work, the journey of doing that will be profound, incredible, fascinating, and surprising, life-changing, life-affirming, genuinely transformative, almost unimaginably enriching, and will literally open up entire new worlds for you. I'd like to finish and wrap all this up with a poem, but please bear with me. The poem's a poem called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, and it's a poem that I often refer to when teaching. And whilst many students are already familiar with it, they don't usually realise just how animist a poem it is until we go through it and I point it out to them. The poem is in 3 sections, and the first section is this: you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body loves what it loves. So let's just take a look at that first section. This is a profoundly animist message. Contemporary culture and much of contemporary spirituality gives us the message that there is something wrong with us. In fact, Carl Rogers, who founded counselling, towards the end of his life, he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked Rogers, so in all the hundreds, probably thousands of clients you've had, what's the commonest thing you've found? And Rogers said that deep down at some level, everybody thinks there's something wrong with them. And he said, and actually, there isn't. But that feeling that there's something wrong with us is common in today's culture, because we are told that we live in sin, that we need to repent, or that we need to raise our vibration to some higher level, or so on. We are given the message that our body, our animal body, is not to be trusted, that it's somehow lesser, that being animal is lesser. And instead, in contrast to this, the older message of animism offers us something entirely different. It offers us the message that there is nothing wrong with you, that all we have to do is just to learn to listen to ourselves, to trust ourselves, and in particular, to listen and trust the deep and profound wisdom of our bodies, and allow ourselves to just be the thing we really are and who we are really meant to be. And in that we will find love and goodness. The second part of the poem is just a single line. It is, Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Now, this is a very psychotherapy part of the poem. We all feel despair at times, and we all need to speak this and be listened to and held, and we need to do that for others too. But this is also very much, again, an animist message that we need community, we need interconnection, we need to help each other. But the third part of the poem is this. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world itself offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. That is deeply animist, what I've been trying to get across. It goes right to the heart of animism because it speaks to us of a much bigger connection that we have all but lost in the modern era. It takes us beyond the human and speaks of the much deeper healing that comes from connecting to the other than human world, of the healing of returning to that world, of homecoming, of taking our rightful place again in the greater than just human family. So, how might all this look in practice? Let me give you an example of a young woman I once worked with. Sasha, let's call her that, had a traumatic childhood, having a narcissistic mother, a father who didn't protect her, and a sister who was the golden child. Sasha was the scapegoat, the outcast in the family. As well as this manifesting as chronic low self-esteem and anxiety disorders in her adult life, this had somatized as digestive disorders, asthma and eczema, and also she had a history of choosing unsuitable partners. As well as come for psychotherapy, Sasha was open to doing shamanic work too. And this is an important first point to make. Not all clients are open to incorporating shamanic work and only want more traditional psychotherapy instead. And if so, then obviously that needs to be respected. Sasha was open to incorporating shamanism though, but had no experience in shamanic journeying herself. So the sessions went like this. We started off exploring things in the usual psychotherapy way, and in doing so, some issues emerged that are things shamanism can help with. These included things like that, like most people these days, she was disconnected from nature and from the other than human people too, animal, plant, and stone, in what shamans call power loss. Another was that she had several indications of soul loss. And again, not just parts of self that were marginalized, but parts that had left her altogether and so were no longer in the room to be dialogued with. And the biggest issue was that she was profoundly ungrounded and disembodied, in that parts of her, not surprisingly given her childhood, were not so much lost as had never even really arrived here in the first place. So, as we'd agreed, we began to use some of our sessions to do shamanic journeys to explore these issues. This consisted of us journeying together, initially with me leading the journeys and speaking the journey out loud as it was actually happening, a bit like a guided visualization. And then as I was doing this, asking Sasha what she could see or feel as we went along. The idea being to empower Sasha so that the more and more journeys we did, journeys became led by her over time. On average, we maybe used 1 in 4 of our sessions to do this, with the sessions in between exploring what had come out of the shamanic work and how this was impacting on her day-to-day life in a more traditionally psychotherapeutic way. The result being, over time, she began to heal her power loss, retrieve lost soul part, and became much more grounded, embodied, and confident, physically healthier, and finally began to draw healthy boundaries with her toxic family and made much healthier relationship choices too. All of which happened not only far more quickly than if we'd only done conventional therapy, but also happened in a much richer, deeper, more solid and embodied, and above all, more soulful way too. And one last point. To do all of this, we started in the shamanic lower world. This was partly specific to her. She was already disembodied enough without risking adding to that with upper world work, and she needed grounding and rooting instead. However, the low world is always where we should start doing shamanic work. And the wise plant people teach us this, particularly the tree people. First, a seed puts down roots. Only when it's done that does it start to reach up to the sky. A tree that neglects its roots and is too eager to reach up becomes top-heavy and sickly. And much of what is wrong with modern day society, including modern spirituality, has forgotten this. And so we live in a culture that is ungrounded and disembodied and cut off from healthy roots and from Mother Earth herself. So in healthy, grounded, embodied and sane shamanism, we always start with growing deep roots, and that means lower work connection first. To come full circle, as Jung said, we do not reach enlightenment by imagining figures of light up there, but by making the darkness conscious. That is why he and the depth psychologists who follow them emphasize depth, emphasize descent. Upper world, without developing deep lower world roots first, without doing the descent, is spiritual bypassing. In healthy shamanism, we only start to rise to the upper world once we are first deeply rooted in the lower world. So that's it. I really hope you have enjoyed this talk and found it interesting. And if you would like to explore more, then please remember to check out my website at www.therapeutic-shamanism.co.uk, as well as the many free resources on the website that I mentioned earlier, including articles, blogs, free ebooks, videos, podcasts, and much more. You'll also find information about my Therapeutic Shamanism series of books, which offer a very practical step-by-step and in-depth guide to learning shamanism, and you'll also find information on the many different and fascinating courses that we offer on shamanism and animism at the Three Ravens College. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to the Institute for Arts in Therapy and Education and to Dr. Margot Sunderland for giving me this opportunity.